go ahead and share that slide so that we could take a look at that. So that's not the one, but that's one I want you to use. So let me scoot things out of the way so I could see. So this is that assignment. And so going down to the end of it, the assigned homework from last year and from previous years was to make your own LCO calculator. We're going to use a term of 20 years, which is fine if we're talking about solar. It's maybe a little bit short for some of the things. Like, for instance, what would you expect a lifetime of we talked about hydroelectric in class and nuclear in class, so those are both longer. How about the lifetime of a gas plant, of a gas peaker or a combined cycle? Does 20 sound kind of about right if you're talking about basically turbine or engines?
It seems a little bit long. Depending on the engine, you're probably looking at probably closer to 10, 15 years. 20 years seems like it could be a little bit long.
Yeah, and that very well could be. And if you think about putting together a gas plant, the big cost is going to be the engine. That its upfront capital cost is low compared to photovoltaics because it's a building with a combustion facility inside of it. So scrapping the engine pretty much is scrapping the project. So we might expect that to be lower than 20. And those numbers we don't really have a good sense on. And so having sources for it becomes important. In this particular case, what they said was, let's take these values for pulverized coal. So that means that I improve the efficiency of coal combustion by smashing it to pieces. So I've got a energy cost up front for doing the pulverization, but then the combustion efficiency is very, very high because it's almost a fluid, it's a powder. The second one is a combined cycle natural gas system. And time-wise, we'll have to see if we have enough time to talk about some of that. Third is so wind. This would be onshore because it's old enough that offshore is just sort of a research topic at that point. And then solar PV. At 150 megawatts, that's big, so that's the utility. So then the other data that I had to use in the spreadsheet was how big was the plant? How much was the cost per kilowatt? And what that means again is that a single panel in photovoltaics is probably half a kilowatt, half or a third. So what I want to know is that for a kilowatt, how many panels do I have to own and what is the cost per kilowatt? Because we'll scale that up. The total cost is going to be related to how big was my plant and how much does it cost per kilowatt installed in the plant. The amount of energy I produced, so the Q's in my problem, are determined by the capacity factor. And we see in the case of solar, because nighttime loses 50% of the day, and dawn and dusk lose enough of the rest of it, I can on average count on about 25%. It's better in some places and worse in others. But if we just want to do a calculation, 25 for solar seems kind of okay. Pulverized coal, there's a maintenance schedule, so 85 seems okay. It's maybe not running full out also. So the nominal size is a spec provided by the company. And the company is probably running it kind of on the high end to get the best value for their quoted value. So 85, again, sounds reasonable for that. So what Carolyn and some other people have done is taken these values. Now, what I did talk about were the two columns in the middle. And we talked briefly in class about those. And there's some discussion in the video also. So the fixed operation and maintenance says it's dollars per megawatt hours. And I actually think that's wrong. But for one of the people that have done it, what did you do with that? And somebody else in Carolyn can talk. I know Carolyn's done this, so I'm not going to pick on her. So in the group of 20-some people we have here, did anybody else start on that with these numbers? And maybe while somebody's thinking about that, what do I mean by the fixed operation and maintenance? JD and I are talking about this a bit before that.
Maybe just like a standard cost that doesn't change each year, just to operate it. And there's going to always be some things you might have to fix or keep up. So that really doesn't,
Sure.
vary much.
That makes perfect sense. If I were to think about, let's take a nuclear power plant as an example, is that I probably pay for a fixed amount of water, whether the plant is running or not. I probably have security force, so I've got labor costs. There are other things which are going to be the same whether I produce any power or not, that I just have made an upfront contract that I've agreed that I'm going to pay that. So then that's why this number is kind of screwy, because it looks like dollars per energy unit. And then the argument would be, well, if I produce no energy, then don't I have any costs? What it should read, if you read the EIA documents, is it should read the units on the denominator would be kilowatt years. And what that means is that the fixed O&M is proportional to the nominal size, because the bigger my plant, the bigger my fixed O&M cost would be. But it's a fixed cost over the year. So I don't care how much power produced. It's how much power, how much cost do I have over the entire year. So the units work out to be the same because it's power multiplied by hours gives you energy type units, but it's actually not energy units. It's for the power that I paid for, the nominal size, over 1 year, what are my fixed costs? This unit is good for the next one. So variable O&M includes things like fuel. And that means if I produce a megawatt, in this case of the first one, the pulverized coal, 1 megawatt produced, 1 megawatt hour produced cost me $30. And that maybe makes sense. I mean, that's not very much coal, $30. So that may be reasonable. And again, we don't know these numbers, but fortunately they're published and we can take advantage of those. Okay, so that's sort of the old numbers. Let me flip to the new numbers. And so for the people that have done this already, this is probably the most useful slide. Oh, let me flip to this one for a second. So this was the older reference. So the one at the top is an advanced pulverized coal unit, 650 megawatts. The capital cost per kilowatt was about $3,000. And the fixed O&M was 37 and the variable was 4.47. So we can say they don't look exactly the same, but the capital cost is about the same. The nominal size is about the same. Some of the other things are comparable. So the link that was in the PowerPoint presentation, this is what the link was. So what I want to do though, is these are old numbers and they probably work okay for coal. But they're probably not good numbers for currently, especially for photovoltaics. So the last document that was published by EIA is this document, and I'll come back down to this page in a second. So the link in there is for this document. The capital cost and performance characteristics for utility scale electrical power generation. And that's kind of the one we want to deal with, because if we want to do apples to apples comparison, I can't compare how expensive solar is that I have on my rooftop to the coal plant I have in my house, because I don't have a coal plant in my house. So let's do comparisons of utilities to get an idea what the energies would be. If I look at this 200-page document, then as I go down it, always start at the front, look for the executive summary or something like that. Is at the very front are the cost and performance technologies. So what they've done is they've taken a lot of utilities that actually exist, and now they've got no numbers for them. So as an example, case one is a supercritical coal, which means it operates extremely high temperatures without carbon capture. So it's got a scrubber tire on it for getting rid of some of the other impurities, but it's not dealing with CO2 at all. Two is suppose I have 30% carbon capture, same size, but now I'm going to actually take some of the energy produced and use it for capturing carbon to minimize my climate change impacts. And 3 is suppose I do it 90%. Okay, and the 1.5 degree guys would say the 90 is where you have to be. Otherwise, it's not a big enough difference. Combined cycle is natural gas. And again, let's do an apples to apples comparison. Let's say we force those guys to capture 90% of the carbon also. So those are cases 2 and 9. And if I go down into this 200-page document, they'll actually give me the details on them. But for this assignment, I just really want to know what are the summary components that are comparable to the chart that was at the end of the presentation. A couple more. One which some of you might be interested in looking at some of the early getting to know you is there are a number of people that are interested in nuclear. So this thing called small modular nuclear is the idea of, can I somehow not have to deal with 20 years of going through regulations and getting a huge site, because it's just going to take me too long to build a power plant. So the standard nuclear power plants, unless you're China, it just takes too long to build them, especially in the United States. But maybe I could do a small one. And if I do a small one, so this would be 50 megawatt small modular reactors, then maybe that works. We're not going to do that one, but we'll talk about it in class. The one that we are going to look at to keep it comparable to the calculation that Carolyn's already done and other people is let's look at onshore wind in the Great Plains. So that's Wyoming. And let's compare that. So this would be a 200 megawatt location, which is tens of windmills. And windmills, strictly speaking, is not the right word. I guess I should call them wind turbines. And then again, keeping consistent with before, let's use utility, so not solar on my rooftop, but let's look at solar photovoltaics with single axis tracking. And we'll do a 150 megawatt AC system in that case. So those are the 4 categories we had at the end of the presentation. Now we need numbers. So let's take a look at number 3 as an example. Its capacity is 650, the same was on the spreadsheet before. Its capital cost is different now. It's higher because now I have carbon capture. So in addition to the furnace and the engine that I'm driving with that, I actually need the environmental remediation hardware. My fixed O&M is dollars per kilowatt year. What do I multiply that by in order to get my cost? So it's basically $60 per kilowatt a year. What do you think? Because again, it's saying this is my cost because I decided I was going to invest in the plant that was this size. And now even if I don't produce power, it's just sitting there. This is going to be my cost.
I'm sorry, why were you multiplying by 60?
So what we're looking for in this case is in the LCOE equation. We had something that looked like this. We said the LCOE is this quantity. It's a ratio of the amount of power produced and the amount of costs I have. So the C's are my costs, and there's an upfront capital cost in year 0. So that one's high. But then I've got associate costs C1 through C7. And those are the things that I pay after I pay for the plant. So the question I was asking is going back to this guy is I'm trying to figure out what are those C1 through C7s and how does the fixed O&M come into it? How do I actually use that number to give me a value?
So would C1 be the fixed cost times the net nominal, and then this, or C0 and the C1 is the variables times the nominal?
Now that's the catch. Great answer, Kylie, and you're almost 100% right, but not quite. So the first part's right. is that if I take the nominal multiplied by the fixed O&M, then that tells me if the plant's not running, I've got contracts in place and that's what I'm going to have to pay. So for every kilowatt, and in the case of number 3, I've got 650 kilowatts. So it's about $60 times 600. So I'm going to pay every year, 60 times 600 is 36,000, 36K. It doesn't matter if it runs or not. So now what I've got is I had an upfront cost of about $6,000 times 600 kilowatt hours. So that's 3, 4, 5, 3.6 mil. So I put in 3.6 mil initial for my investment. Then I've got another big chunk, which is my about $3,000 or $4,000 a year in fixed O&M cost. So that's half of my C1. But now I have to take the variable O&M cost also. How do I add that in? And Kylie was almost right. So her suggestion was take the variable O&M and multiply it by the nominal capacity. Unit-wise, you can see you have to fudge a little bit because that's megawatt hours and stuff like that. So there may be ways you could fix that. Okay, so this is where I'm relying on somebody who maybe has done this already, is how much energy do I produce? So I'm in the case of 3, I have a nominal capacity of 650 kilowatts. So in 1 year, if I multiply that by a little bit over 8,000 hours, then I should be able to figure out my kilowatt hours, right? What's wrong with that?
That's assuming it's at 100% capacity, but probably isn't.
Right. So the thing I'm missing on this chart is capacity factor, because if I could take that 650, multiply it by the 8,600 and whatever numbers per year, then I could calculate how much energy I produce if I knew the capacity factor. Let's flip back to this presentation. Let's get an idea of what the capacity factor is. Whoops, I can't get off this button. Excuse me a second, why? So capacity factor in the case of pulverized coal is 85%. And we said it, that kind of makes sense. Is that I know the plant's just going to run, right? It doesn't care whether the sun's up or down. So I've got a capacity factor in that case. I could go back here now and say what I'm looking at in this case is I've got 650 kilowatts, but I'm only going to produce 85% of that on average. So I multiply those two, and then I multiply by the number of hours in a year, and I could figure out what my production would be. I'm sorry, what my cost, I could figure out what my production would be. And then if I multiply it by $11 per megawatt hour of production, then I get that cost also. So now my C1 has 2 parts. It's got the fixed O&M and the variable O&M, and that's it. Every year is going to be similar in a simple model. So in a more complex model, what's going to happen as year goes by with respect to my production? Will it go up, stay the same, or go down?
Probably go down.
Probably, right? I mean, it's fairly likely that whether I'm talking about a motor or a solar cell, that as time goes by, the efficiency decreases. Maybe even things break. So I'll get a decrease. And so in a more sophisticated model, we have a D rate, the amount that the power utility decreases as a function of time. And that'd be something else we'd have to include in it, but we're not going to worry about that. We're just going to say that this is going to stay the same. And so from my 20 years of operation, I can calculate C1 through C20 by just doing that calculation. Now, with respect to where does capacity factor come from, there's a couple places I could get that. One place would be here. And these are probably not far from being right, but let's try and find something more current. The other one, the second document that's linked in there, is Blizzard. So Blizzard was the one we used in class. So this is somebody who spent a lot of time think about how to do LCOE calculations. And they're a private company, so they make their living doing this. And these are the numbers they came up with. And that all sounds good, but we'd like to know, how did they actually figure this out? So in the document, every year they include, as I go down to it, the key assumptions. So in the key assumptions, if I were to look at, let's find my coal again. So here's my coal. If I assume that I'm building a new case, and I've done really, really well. So the low case is I really optimize my plant so that I get the lowest cost possible for the LCOE. Is what are the things that are included in that? I could see one way I could do that is I keep the plant running all the time. So their argument is that best case scenario is I've designed a plant that runs well, so it runs 83% of the time. And that's very much like the 85 number we've seen already. It's also got the other things in theory in here, but I wanted to use the EIA data rather than try and focus on this one. But again, you can kind of see the same things in here. It's got about 3,000 capital costs. Fixed O&M is about 40. Variable is 2.75. I think we had variable on the other one was around 10 and fixed was around 60. So these are a little bit lower. They're kind of in the middle of what you can see between the low and the high end. So let's stick with the EIA numbers, these ones, for that part of the calculation. Use the low end. So I'm going to at least say the best case situation for the capacity factor in this case, and then do my calculation of the LCOE. Okay, so let me stop there. Let me do one last thing then. So I wanted to again do the same assignment more or less with updated numbers. So the closest we have in the new data from the 2020 sheets is number 3, which is carbon capture. Number 9, which is natural gas with carbon capture. So we've got coal and natural gas. Just as kind of an aside, looking at those 2 columns at 3 and 9, any takeaways from those? If you're looking at them? So I'm going to sit here and have you guys think about this a bit. So I'm not going to move until somebody tells me something comparing 3 and 9.
It looks like coal is a higher investment and it's more costly. But yeah.
Right. So the coal is almost $6,000, and the carbon capture is only less than half that. So the coal plant was way more expensive to build than the natural gas, which is good. And again, maybe that makes some sense because in the coal, I'm managing a solid medium. I have to pulverize it. So I've got a train that comes in with chunks of coal. I have to send it through a pulverizer. So now I've got a pulverizer stage. I probably have dust bags and all sorts of other things to manage pieces around that. As you can see how that could be pretty expensive. In the case of natural gas, I have a tank of natural gas and I connect it to the system and it runs. So capital costs are significantly different. I think you said something else, but I forgot what it was already.
I said they're like capital costs and also fixed costs is higher.
Okay. So I look at the fixed O&M,
And
carbon
variable.
and variable. So everything's kind of high. Okay, so I want somebody else to add one last thing maybe to that before we move on. How about efficiency? Any comments on efficiency comparing those two?
My guess would be just basically looking at the net nominal heat rates, just that coal has, you know, a little over 5,000. There's a difference in about 5,000 between coal and natural gas in terms of that value.
Right.
That a lot of the energy produced by coal gets turned into heat that's not usable. So just kind of like wasted energy.
Sure, exactly. So when I look at that number, you could see that the units are BTU per kilowatt hour. So to produce a kilowatt hour takes a lot more BTU in the case of coal. So you can see a lot of positives. And in fact, when you look at the US grid and through a good chunk of the world, the death of coal has had nothing to do with PV. It's had to do with natural gas, because we can see natural gas is better in almost every aspect of it. Okay, so that's that one. The other two we'll look at is, so 3 and 9 would be looking at, and we'll talk about hydro later also, and landfill gas and some of these other ones if we have time, is keeping with what we had before, is onshore wind in the Great Plains. So again, Wyoming is, let's look at that one. So nominal 200 kilowatt size. And some numbers associated going past that. So again, heat rate doesn't make any sense, right? Because I'm not burning anything. But I've got capital costs, fixed costs, and variable costs. The thing you notice about this page with the renewables is that the variable costs are effectively zero. Now that's maybe not quite right, because there probably are some things tied in with, for instance, maintenance is a function of how often, but they're so small that for this estimation, they're taking those to be zero. Same thing when 24, which is PV, is that I can again see that for the plant in that case is I've got a capital cost, and I'm going to flip to the other slide in just a second. So the capital cost for the latest numbers is $13 per kilowatt, so $1.3 per watt. It's got a fixed O&M, so there are going to be things that I have to do in terms of maintaining this field. Tracking means that the panels move. So there are motors, which means there's maintenance. I have to clean the panels. Turns out that's kind of a big deal. So there is some stuff. I could use all this in the LCOE calculation to get a number. I'm going to bet the number that we get from this one. And so, Carolyn, you might save that sheet that you've got already from last year's calculation. I'm going to bet this is going to come in a lot lower. I want to compare the capital costs. So remember, $1.3 per watt. And we'll look at the presentation. And they had solar at $2 per watt. So it's almost a factor 2 change with respect to the capital cost. And that's what has driven PV. All right. I think that's all I kind of had in mind. Oh, yeah. Last thing for the rubric. So the simplest form of it, if you do quote unquote average work, you get a spreadsheet that can do this calculation, calculate the LCOE for my system. And I'll get 4 values, and I'll see whether or not the PV is going to be more or less expensive than coal and natural gas and wind. What's your gut feeling about which one's going to be the cheapest? And I'm going to poll you guys on this. Well, I'm not going to actually write a poll, but I'm going to ask each one of you to give me an answer. So if you're to rank the lowest and the highest, which is probably all I can remember, what do you think is going to be the least expensive and what's going to be the most expensive? Go ahead, JD. I'm going to start at the top of my screen and work down.
I would think that natural gas probably be the cheapest to produce just because it's been around for a while. You know, people have been pumping it out. You know, it's there. It's already been worked on.
Sounds good. How about the most expensive?
Right now, I would say instead of between solar and wind.
There's solar, wind, and coal. So there's all 4.
I'd say probably wind right now.
Okay.
There's all the stuff going into it.
Okay. Nicholas, you're next.
I'll agree with natural gas just because there's a lot of natural gas in this country. And,
Sure.
you know, like he said, we've been using it for a while, so we've gotten pretty good at getting the most out of it. In terms of probably the most expensive, even though it's been going down in years, I'm going to say solar. I'm
Okay.
going to say solar.
Okay. Andrew.
Initially, I agreed. I think natural gas, at least in the States, is easily going to be the cheapest. I'm going to go solar PV at the second, wind, coal at third, and then the most expensive as wind. That's what I'm going to go with.
Okay, sounds good.
I have faith in my solar panel.
Ken, do you go by Ken or Kenneth?
I actually go by Kenny usually.
Kenny sounds good. Okay.
Yeah. Again, natural gas. I mean, it's kind of hard to pick anything else. And then for most expensive, I don't know. I mean, I live next to a bunch of wind farms because I'm from like Washington, and it's all just hydro and like wind farms everywhere. So I think I'm going to say solar panels.
Okay, sounds good. Kylie, you've talked a lot, so I'm going to let somebody else jump in. Okay, so Alan, you're on my next to my list. We'll do a couple more people and then we'll move on. So Alan, you've just run. Oh, as an aside, Alan, I need to figure out how to open up the old assignments, but there are a couple that I want you to do. I've excused a few of them, but there's the getting to know you, for instance, I want to get you to take a look at. Okay, I'll send you an email.
All right, sounds good. Oh shit. Oh, sorry about that. I'm in a room with Zane right now. Got a little feedback, but I feel like the most expensive is going to be photovoltaics, as like the level of processing is probably going to be pretty high for creating those panels. And I feel like the least expensive would be natural gas.
Okay. So Dominic, I'm going to ask you next, and then after that, I'm going to jump to anybody who has a different opinion. Jump in. So Dominic, why don't you go ahead? Because so far we've got natural gas seems to be the big winner, and the big loser. It's been kind of split.
I couldn't hear the question.
Sure. With respect to the 4 different technologies we're going to look at as part of this assignment, you're going to calculate the LCOE. And what I want you to do is predict with these new numbers who's going to win. Best and worst.
Well, I kind of agree. I feel like the PV will be pretty expensive.
Okay.
Just because of the natural resources side of it. I'm not sure. I believe it requires a lot of rare earth metals. And then probably natural gas be the cheapest just because of how much we have, how much resources we have in the United States of natural gas. But I guess transporting that is hard. So I don't know. Those are just kind of my thoughts.
Yeah, that's sort of an interesting question that I don't know the answer to. And maybe one reason to not use the Lazard numbers is that the Lazard number for the variable O&M would probably average fuel costs over the world. And the US number probably is going to be lower for natural gas because, as you said, we've got so much natural gas here. Okay, of the remaining people, anybody have a different opinion they'd like to express and have recorded? And of course, there's no grade associated with that, so you could say whatever you want. Okay, let me throw 2 more things in, which maybe are not considerations in this. The 2 examples we're looking at are coal and natural gas with carbon capture, which will make them more expensive. And then the other one is we've just decided that PV's gone down by a factor of 2 in terms of cost over about a decade.
I think coal might be more expensive because it requires more upkeep and heat production, and there's a lot more wasted. And yeah.
So it's possible coal could be up there. Okay, well, anyway, we're going to find out.
Also, where the PV we're looking at isn't residential, it's utility. So I think it's a much cheaper at a larger scale. So
right,
yeah.
well, that's a good point, is that we are definitely looking at utility.
And I will say, I do know multiple people who have residential solar panels and stuff on the roofs, and like it's not as expensive as you would think. Like a lot of people who I wouldn't even really think are like, I don't know. Yeah, I don't think the photovoltaics are as expensive as people think they are.
They're actually, and we'll talk about when we get to PV, is even residential and rooftop with subsidies turns out to be cost competitive right now. And when we go to utilities, like Kylie said, then we've got some economies of scale that make it even more favorable. So it's not as expensive for sure as it was at the point that this assignment was created the first time. Okay, so let me ask you if you've got some questions on the assignment. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. I forgot the extensions. All right, so you can get 70% of the grade by just doing those 4. So people that have done the spreadsheet already with those 4 technologies, then you're in good shape. You will get another 15% by doing 1 additional technology when you're interested in. So maybe I saw that, I think Andrew nodding earlier at nuclear plants is maybe take a look at nuclear. And then the last 15% is just like a very, very short commentary on maybe an observation from the results. So now it's just not just a spreadsheet, it's a bit more. Adding in the extra technology is easy within the spreadsheet. Adding in the comment is just fill in a cell. So you only have 1 document upload, potentially 50 points, so half the assignment, 4 technologies with numbers from the resources that I've mentioned, which means I don't actually know what the answers are. I haven't actually run this myself. And then another technology, a 5th one that you're interested in for an extra 15% past the baseline of 70. And I haven't written this on the page because I was just writing it when JD came in at first. So I'll put those on the page for with respect to the rubric. And then the last part of the rubric is just some meaningful statement about some of your results. So maybe the result that Andrew's going to come up with is that we should all be running small nuclear plants in our backyard.
I have a question.
Sure.
So for the presentation, the numbers on the presentation that says homework, the nominal size, its units is megawatts, but for the PDF, it's kilowatts. So we just convert that to megawatts, or do you want to keep it? Would you want to keep that as kilowatts, megawatts, or?
You know, that's actually interesting because, as you mentioned, there were some that looked like they were from the same set.
Like this just says 650, and then if you go to the PDF, it also says 650, but I don't know which unit is correct.
So what do you think is a good size for a plant?
I don't know.
So that would be an interesting search for so let's see, if I were looking at these numbers, these are too small for the nominal capacity. So great point. These look like they should almost be megawatts.
So anything that's in the PowerPoint is accurate, but this is wrong, the PDF?
That's bizarre that this would not have had that. Yeah, in fact, I mean, if you look over here in the description.
Yeah, it does say megawatt, but then the title says.
So I don't know why the net nominal is wrong. It looks like it's just an error.
So should we treat that? Should we treat that first column as megawatts, or
yes?
Should we? Are there any other resources just to double check our numbers so we have like at least somewhat accurate results? Because that's like it's a fact. That's a big factor, you know.
Yeah. Well, let's take a look at the Lazard calculations. So again, there are a bunch of people working with the same number. So let's see what they were looking at. In the case of coal, they were looking at a 600 megawatt plant. So that's kind of considered as 650. Their capital costs were around 3,000 per kilowatt, which is also consistent with the other one. So these look like about the same. One of the interesting things about here that we can kind of take a look at is we were talking a little bit about the idea of how long do we think things last. So one thing that Lazard includes inside of it is how long is it going to last? What's a reasonable lifetime? So in the case of nuclear and coal, they're saying 40 years. In terms of gas, 20. So what somebody pointed out earlier, that a gas plant's going to have a shorter lifetime, actually is consistent with what's in this publication. And let's see the other ones that it has. In the case of geothermal 25, wind 20, and solar 30. Looking at, so this 25 for facility lifetime, that's with the D rate on it. But if you buy a panel right now, the panels typically have 10 years material warranty, which means that they don't expect the cell to fail. But it has a 25-year operational warranty, which means that the power decrease is only something like 10% over 25 years, assuming it's still running. So these numbers make perfect sense. So I think, again, Lazard does this for a living, is they've gone through and they recognize what power plants typically last lengthwise. Having said that, that's typical. There are nuclear power plants that have been in operation way more than 40 years.
I was about to say, like, there are even some like still operational that were built back in like the 50s, and
yep,
and those are way they're primitive models compared to what they're building today.
Yeah. So yeah, so thanks for pointing that out about that. That is kind of weird. Kilowatts is pretty tiny. So like rooftops have kilowatts on them on somebody's house, but utility fields are megawatts. So then,
All right, thank you.
You can get a little bit of an estimate by looking at your neighbor's roof. How many panels do they have on it? If you look at your neighbors, Kenneth, you'd mentioned, or Kenny, you'd mentioned that your neighbors have PV on it.
Oh, yeah, they had like, I think it was probably like a good 7 foot by 7 foot kind of like array of them. But I mean, my grandpa built like a Overlander truck, and he put some solar panels on his truck to charge some batteries so he could have like a refrigerator in his truck.
Got it. So he probably had like maybe 2-3 panels on it.
Yeah, like just a couple.
But he'd have about a kilowatt. So you can see a kilowatt's not a very big number. I mean, this is a PV on a truck. And so in a utility field, it's going to be much, much larger than kilowatt, more than a few orders of magnitude. So these are way too small. So yeah, so I guess whoever was editing this missed that one.
This is an unrelated question, but me, Andrew, and Alan are all in a group, and I was wondering if there's any way we could pick up a fourth member, or if it was just going to be the three of us.
I'm kind of, so the class lists are set now. So there are 50 people in the class. 50 divided by 4 is not an integer. So that makes it a little bit more challenging. I don't know what's happening with one of the groups. So this is the bottom 2 groups. I'm sorry, not the bottom 2. There are 2 groups, I think, that had 3 in them. Let me do 50 divided by 4. So
no, there's 2 groups that have 3 in them.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, my ideal group size would have been 3, but with 50 people in the class, that's just way too many groups because it means lots and lots of projects and grading. So I think you're not going to be overburdened too much.
Yeah, I already talked to Professor Ono about seeing if we could pick up a 5th member on Tuesday, but he basically said the same thing. Also, we've had a couple communication issues with emailing back and forth. So yeah, we apologize, but yeah,
no problem.
If someone does like join the class late, well, I guess today is Census Day.
Right. Yesterday was Census Day.
Yesterday was Census Day, so that's about it. But
anybody needs a group, that's what we're trying to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we can talk about it a bit more, but I think you'll find 3 is okay. And 3 in some sense is a bit more flexibility in the sense that within a short period of time, you have to decide what your in the news project is, something that's happened in the last year or 2. Sometimes 4 makes it harder because they have different interests and you get stuck doing something you'd rather not. In 3, there's only a 1/3 chance or 2/3 chance you'll get stuck doing something you're not interested in. And project-wise, there are 3, but one of them is effectively an individual project. So in the news is a group project. And the final project, which is still being refined, is looking at an energy system in some detail, is a group project also. But again, I think for 3 people. None of them are very long documents. So we're not looking for like a capstone senior design project or anything like that. So I think you'll be okay with 3. So I would prefer doing that then, because the other alternative would be having the people spread out over groups that are currently 4, and then there's a bunch of groups of 5, or having a group of 6 or 2 groups of 5 or something like that. 5 is just too big of a number.
Excuse me?
Uh-huh.
If you look at the fixed cost, it's also in kilowatts, and on the table you gave us, it says megawatts.
The one that's in the
fixed costs of operation and
right.
management.
So this was in kilowatt years. And if you look at the one that was in the presentation, it's in megawatt hours. I haven't done the conversion. You should be able to do that. But again, remember, this isn't an energy unit, because what it should be is your cost of operation for the installed kilowatts for 1 year. So even though unit-wise it works out to be the same, they're not the same number, if that makes any sense.
Okay. So
And
I'd have to convert it.
yeah, so let's take a look at Lazard. So Lazard also has in kilowatt years. So I think the only typo in the EIA document is probably this one. And you can immediately see it's wrong because the column before it says it's wrong.
Professor, could you just go over what unit specifically we need to be using? I'm just very confused because like all these sources have different units.
Sure. So your plant size should be the nominal capacity in megawatts in the case of this one. So maybe read this column instead to some extent to get the mapping. And so that would be similar to the assignment you've already done. The capital cost is typically in dollars per kilowatt in all the publications. And so this is got that form, as does Lazard and as does the old publication. The fixed O&M cost is dollars per kilowatt installed capacity per year. And the one that's inconsistent, and that's when I realized there was something wrong with the numbers that were in the file that was published by somebody else, is that megawatt hours I don't think is right. I mean, it's possible. So let's see, how do we do the conversion? We would have to take, to go to megawatts, we'd have to multiply by 1,000. And to go from a year to an hour, we would divide by 8640. So it's like a factor of 1/10. And that looks like it might come in pretty close, but I haven't done it. But I don't like those units because megawatt hours, that product looks like an energy unit and it's not an energy unit. So I would go with the column inside of here, which is dollars per kilowatt per year. And so Carolyn, this might actually alter your calculation, because if your calculation had that being proportional to the energy produced, because it was in megawatt hours, that's actually not correct. This cost doesn't care how much energy you produce at all. Hence the name fixed.
Okay, so our LCOE should be in dollars per kilowatt year.
Your LCOE would be in dollars per energy unit. So if you want to do it in megawatt hours, that's also fine. But for sure, it's something like kilowatt hours. And it won't be per year, because it's going to be the ratio of the cost per year divided by the production per year. And it's not just the cost in that particular year, because it's over the 20 years of its existence.
Okay, sounds good. So it's just the variable O&M cost we have to convert.
Convert in what sense?
Well, you just said before that we'd have to convert megawatt hour to kilowatt year. Right.
Not quite. Let me flip up a white. Oh, actually, I don't have a pen. I'm sorry, I'm doing on my desktop, so I can't actually write on the screen. Yeah, so let's go backwards for a couple seconds. When we think about how do we calculate the LCOE, and you can maybe tell me whether you did something different already, is that what I'm doing for this calculation in one of these is that I'm figuring out the CIs, which are dollars. And then the 1 plus D is the discount rate, so it's 1.09 for our problem. And it's different for every year. And then the QIs, so that would be, the Cs are actually dollar per year because it's my cost for that year. And then the QIs is the number of kilowatt hours or megawatt hours per year. So the per years cancel out because I'm looking at the calculation where the quantities, both C and Q, are annual numbers. And so then my final answer should be in dollars per energy unit. And kilowatt hours kind of makes the most sense because I sort of know what I expect, because when I pay for electricity, I pay in Denver 13 cents per kilowatt hours. So $0.13 per kilowatt hour. So that's the unit I'm kind of looking to compare things to.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. That makes sense.
I have a question. On the document, it says we need to have the plant size in kilowatts, but where do we find that information?
You could just take the megawatts and multiply it by 1,000.
Okay.
I use kilowatts because I like the column in that document, but now that it's been corrected, maybe I'll edit that to be megawatts.
Okay,
We're just going to go again with these plant sizes because they modeled these. If you go way down in the document, these are modeled on actual plants. So if we're looking at the ultra-critical coal, it gives you the actual numbers associated with that. So I was using this table because it represents real data and real recent data. And because I was using that when I read the header on it, I read kilowatts, and so I went with that. And so I can change that to megawatts, and that would be fine. So again, what you're going to be doing is you're setting up an Excel spreadsheet. You've got columns that correspond to the ones that are inside of this document as I go down it. Whether or not it's kilowatts or megawatts in your column, ultimately it's not going to make any difference because it just means in your cells where you do the calculation, there's going to be a factor of 1,000 difference that you have to include into it. Your takeaway on this should be, like we're just talking about, is that if this is at all a meaningful way of generating electricity, if you get that it costs you $100 per kilowatt hour, then probably something is wrong because I only pay 13 cents. So nobody's going to pay for anything except for maybe fusion that costs $100 per kilowatt hour. So anyway, kind of a guide for whether or not you've got the right calculation.
What about cold fusion?
Say it again.
What about cold fusion?
Cold fusion?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, isn't it?
Ion catalyzed fusion. It's a possibility.
It was
in 200 years.
Abdullah, did you have a question too?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was gonna say, just to be clear, is it gonna be in kilowatts per hour?
No. So your answer for the LCOE is going to be my cost per unit energy. So it should be in dollars per kilowatt hour or megawatt hours. I mean, the cost per megawatt hour is going to be 1,000 times higher.
I meant for the fixed O&M cost. Dollars per kilowatt hour.
It's in dollars per kilowatt in 1 year. And that's why they've got it written as $/kilowatt-year.
Okay. So I don't have to convert from whatever's in the table.
Well, tell me what you can do with that number.
To convert it?
To use it in your LCOE calculation, because I want to use this to calculate my C1. So how to use that number to calculate C1?
So, 1 second. I'd have to go look at the slides again.
The slides actually don't say it. This is the unit part to sort of sort out. And again, the thing to keep in mind is that there's a reason for calling it the fixed cost. As a fixed cost means every year I pay the same thing, doesn't matter what.
Right.
So that's the year part of this notation. But it's not just years. It's not the cost per year, which is what's in the denominator. It's also the cost per kilowatt. So how do I calculate the fixed cost then for my plant?
I guess I'd use the nominal size and the capital cost, since that cost is always the same.
Do I need the capital cost? Because my capital cost was my year zero cost. Is it said that I built a hydroelectric plant, and in the first construction phase, which was going to last more than a year, I had to bulldoze a valley, build a concrete structure, and install turbines. So my capital cost is just the year zero cost.
So would I do fixed O&M times nominal size, and then I sum that with the variable times the nominal again, and then divide that by the discount to the power of
Okay.
the
So that's
year?
close. Can somebody tell me what the correction is on that? So I'm going to take the fixed, multiply it by the nominal capacity, which now is in megawatts, not in kilowatts. And that'll give me my annual fixed O&M cost. And that's going to be half of C1, not half, but it's a part of it.
Oh, is it going to be 1 plus the discount
It is
to the
not.
power?
Now that'll be the denominator. And the reason for that, again, is because if I'm talking about either what I'd pay for power in the future or what I'm paying for O&M, there's an interest rate associated with it. So the discount rate is just take into account that things that are in the future have different costs for me now. Anybody want to jump in?
So are you asking like what the other aspect of that cost is going to be?
Yeah, how'd you
Essentially.
calculate it?
So, well, you need the variable O&M cost to go in with the fixed each year.
Right.
So you're going to need to know that same nominal value, but you also need the capacity factor.
Right.
So essentially, you can multiply your capacity factor by that nominal value to get that that energy value, and then you can multiply that by the variable O&M cost.
Exactly. So again, because the variable depends on how much energy you produce, and the capacity factor says, on average, for a nominal capacity, the amount of energy it produces is a product of those two. And the example I gave with solar is a quarter.